Good evening. Welcome to Bible study on Thursday night. This is the week of July the 17th, and we welcome you. It's good to be back with you between my own vacation and an awesome week at our Church of Vacation Bible School. We've been unable to keep up with having our Thursday evening online sessions of Bible school for obvious reasons, but we're back. We are actually nearly finished with the Old Testament in our quest to complete the Bible in a year. Now, tonight we're looking at the prophetic books of Nahum, Habakkuk, and Zephaniah. These three all prophesied to the southern kingdom of Judah prior to Jerusalem and Judah falling. They are the last of the pre-exile prophets. And more about that next week. We'll start with Nahum. Nahum prophesied about 150 years after Jonah. The book of Nahum is a little bit like a sequel to Jonah. Nahum has the very same subject as Jonah, and that is the destruction of Nineveh. We don't know a whole lot about Nahum. It is presumed he was from the Galilee area and from the area of Capernaum. Now, the name for Capernaum, which was Kepher Nahum, actually means village of Nahum. So Nahum not only may have was likely from there, but was a very important figure there, and the village eventually was named for him. Nahum addressed the nation of Judah. Nahum writes with a style of poetry that is both lyrical and forceful. Nahum chapter 1, verse 3 gives us the central message of Nahum, and that is this: the Lord is slow to anger, great in power, and will not at all acquit the wicked. Now, Nahum, like all three of the books we're looking at this evening, is a 3-chapter book. And the chapters are pretty definite in the material they cover. Chapter 1 tells of the certainty of the doom of Nineveh. Chapter 2 speaks of the siege and the actual events of the siege and the battle at Nineveh. It is a graphic chapter. Chapter 3 then gives the reasons for the judgment upon Nineveh. So let's go ahead and look a little more in depth at chapter 1. The certainty of Nineveh's doom. Nineveh was the capital of Assyria. And in the days of Nahum, it was the world's greatest city. It's interesting to note that 2 of the minor prophets are devoted to that city, both Jonah and Nahum. A little over 100 years before, Jonah had preached to them. And now the city of Nineveh has gone deeper into sin. The revival that happened after the preaching of Jonah had delayed the judgment of God by a century. In reading the 2 books, we see both the goodness of God and in Jonah, and we also see the severity of God in dealing with sin in Nahum. Let's look at the word a little bit. In Nahum, we're going to look at chapter 1, verses 2 and 3. The Lord is a jealous and avenging God. The Lord takes vengeance and is filled with wrath. The Lord takes vengeance on his foes and maintains his wrath against his enemies. The Lord is slow to anger and great in power. The Lord will not leave the guilty unpunished. His way is in the whirlwind and the storm, and clouds are the dust of his feet. So it's very certain here, because God is a God who is jealous and avenging. Very certain what the doom of Nineveh will be. Verses 6 through 8. Who can withstand his indignation? Who can endure his fierce anger? His wrath is poured out like fire. The rocks are shattered before him. The Lord is good, a refuge in times of trouble. He cares for those who trust him. But with an overwhelming flood, he will make an end of Nineveh. He will pursue his foes into darkness. And verse 15 of chapter 1. Look, there on the mountains, the feet of one who brings good news, who proclaims peace. Celebrate your festivals, O Judah, and fulfill your vows. No more will the wicked invade you. They will be completely destroyed. Now, this set of 3 verses from Nahum chapter 1, verse 15, and we're going to look at Isaiah 52, verse 7, and look at the similarities in how they treat the messenger of God, who the messenger of God is. Isaiah 52, verse 7, Isaiah said, how beautiful on the mountains are the feet of those who bring good news, who proclaim peace, who bring good tidings, who proclaim salvation, who say to Zion, your God reigns. And then into the New Testament, Romans chapter 10, verse 15. And how can they preach unless they are sent? As it is written, how beautiful are the feet of those who bring good news. Now, chapter 2 of Nahum deals with the siege and the capture of Nineveh. Nineveh is pictured as making preparation for the attack. They have an alliance of Medes, Babylonians, Scythians, and others. And the battle is vividly described. The river gates are opened. The palace is basically dissolved. Just to pick out a few, and as I said, this is pretty graphic. It is the telling of a destruction of a city, of a battle. Verse 3, the shields of his soldiers are red. The warriors are clad in scarlet. The metal on the chariots flashes on the day that they are made ready. Chariots storm through the streets, rushing back and forth like flaming torches. The river gates are thrown open. The palace collapses. Nineveh is like a pool, and water is draining away. Plunder the silver, plunder the gold. She is pillaged, plundered, stripped. Bodies tremble, faces grow pale. That's a little bit of a sense of what's going on. Now, chapter 3 shows the sins of Nineveh that were great, that were the cause for this judgment. Verses 4 through 6, and we're in chapter 3 now. All because of the wanton lust of a harlot, alluring the mistress of sorceries, who enslaved nations by her prostitution and peoples by her witchcraft. I am against you, declares the Lord Almighty. I will lift your skirts over your face. I will show the nations your nakedness and the kingdoms your shame. I will pelt you with filth. I will treat you with contempt and make you a spectacle. Nineveh fell in the year 608 BC. The city of Nineveh was so completely destroyed that in the 2nd century AD, even the site of where the city was unknown. Currently, there are excavations that have begun to take place at where they believe the site of Nineveh was. And of course, the excavations that are taking place confirm the biblical story. They confirm the words of Nahum as to how the battle went and the gates falling and the palace disintegrating. Now let's move to the book of Habakkuk. The book of Habakkuk is prophecy And the focus of Habakkuk is the nation of Babylon. Babylon is coming, Judah. You'd better get your act together. These sins of yours are going to result in the Babylonians coming in. So that's the focus for Habakkuk. Obadiah spoke of the fate of Edom, Nahum, the fate of Assyria. Habakkuk speaks of the fate of Babylon. In the first chapter, Habakkuk speaks to God alone about a problem that has bothered him regarding how Jehovah is dealing with governments in the nations. The first part of the book of Habakkuk we could call a colloquy. In other words, it is a talk, it is a discourse between Jehovah God and Habakkuk. Habakkuk writes with a passionate love for his people. They believe Habakkuk was likely a Levite or a musician. The first part of the book is this dialogue between Habakkuk and Jehovah. The last part is also a dialogue between Habakkuk and Jehovah. The last part is a beautiful description of a theophany. What is a theophany? A theophany is a visual appearance of God, a visible appearance of God. Habakkuk wrote shortly after the city of Nineveh fell, which would have been 608 BC and following. The Chaldeans, the Babylonians, they were the ones that were rising to power now. The Assyrians were beginning with the fall of Nineveh. The Assyrians are falling from power, and the new kid on the block, the new power, is Babylon. Habakkuk wrote his prophecy to the people in the southern nation, Judah. And just as a reminder of our history, at this point, Judah, remember there were two Hebrew countries after the time of Solomon when the country split. And there was the northern kingdom called Israel, southern kingdom called Judah. At this point, Israel, the people have already been carried off into captivity. There are people living up there, but there is no nation. They are under the influence of the Assyrians. And let's take a look. So Habakkuk is writing shortly after the fall of Nineveh, and these changes are taking place on the world stage. Let's take a look at our timeline. Here's our Old Testament timeline that we've been looking at, and creation, flood, Babel. Then we have the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, Egypt, then the Exodus out of Egypt, the time of the judges, the early kings. And here we have the nation being divided, kings of Israel, kings of Judah. Okay, 722, this is when the northern kingdom falls in captivity, 722. And then down in through here, you'll see Jeremiah is one of the prophets in here. And here is 605. And this is the neighborhood of, remember, Nineveh falls in 608. This is the time period here in which Habakkuk is writing. He was a contemporary of Jeremiah and Ezekiel and Daniel as well. So they are all writing during this time period. So that gives you an idea of where we are in the time period. Now, the chapters of Habakkuk are much like the chapters in Nahum, 3 chapters, and each one has a specific focus. Chapter 1 is the burden, the why things are happening the way they are, the burden that Habakkuk is carrying for, Lord, why don't you do something about what's going on in the world? Chapter 2 is the vision. Chapter 3 is a prayer. Now, chapter 1, let's look at a little more closely. The burden. The structure of the book comes from the first thoughts in each chapter. As you look at chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, the first thoughts written in each chapter give you the structure. In chapter 1, Habakkuk is concerned. He's perplexed with the silence of God. Here, sin was abounding. Sin was going nuts. And so Habakkuk cries out to God, how can you put up with this evil? How can you put up with this sin? Verse 2 says, how long, O Lord, must I call for help, but you do not listen, or cry out to you, violence, Lord, but you don't save. So that's what Habakkuk is crying out to God here in chapter 1, this burden. He's very concerned. He's perplexed with the silence of God. Sin is abounding. Verse 3, why do you make me look at injustice? Why do you tolerate wrong? There's injustice, there's wrong. Destruction and violence are before me. There's strife, conflict abounds. Lord, do something. In verse 4, therefore the law is paralyzed and justice never prevails. The wicked hem in the righteous so that justice is perverted. I say he has very legitimate complaints, and so he cries out. Now in verses 5 through 11, God answers him. Look at the nations and watch and be utterly amazed. For I am going to do something in your days that you would not believe, even if you were told. And he goes on to say that he's raising up the Babylonians, and the Babylonians are going to be his vessel. The Babylonians are going to be God's way of dealing with the sins of his people, Judah, and the city of Jerusalem. God basically says, wait and see, Habakkuk. It's coming. It's coming. And that moves us then into chapter 2, and that is the vision. God gives Habakkuk a wonderful vision in chapter 2. There are two great pledges that God gives to Habakkuk. Verses 5 through 11. In verses 5 through 11. Verse 4 is one. See, he is puffed up. And this is speaking of the Babylonians. His desires are not upright, but the righteous will live by his faith. There's one. And verse 14. For the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord. The earth will be filled with the knowledge and the glory of the Lord. The righteous will live by faith. Verse 4, that verse is so significant that it is quoted 3 times in the New Testament. Romans chapter 1, verse 17. Quotes from Habakkuk. For in the gospel, a righteousness from God is revealed, a righteousness that is by faith from first to last. Just as it is written, the righteous will live by faith. And then in Galatians chapter 3, verse 11. Clearly, no one is justified before God by the law, because the righteous will live by faith. And in Hebrews chapter 10, verse 38. But my righteous one will live by faith. My righteous one will live by faith. Verse 14 of Habakkuk chapter 2 should be looked at in looking to the future. For the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. That should be written in the light of writings that we have in the New Testament regarding the last days. Notice in chapter 2, verse 3 of Habakkuk, God says to Habakkuk, "For the revelation awaits an appointed time. It speaks of the end and will not prove false." God's saying, it's not going to prove false. I'm going to take care of what I said I'm going to do. Though it linger, wait for it. Even though it may take some time, wait for it, Habakkuk. It's coming. It will certainly come and will not delay. God's saying, wait for it. It will come, Habakkuk. Then chapter 3 is a prayer. And the prayer of Habakkuk begins with a prayer for revival. Chapter 3, verse 2. Lord, I have heard of your fame. I stand in all of your deeds, O Lord. Renew them in our day. In other words, reform us, revive us, Lord, again. Renew them in our day. In our time, make them known. In wrath, remember mercy. What a prayer for us as well today. Renew them in our day, Lord. From verse 3 through 15, there are words of praise for Jehovah's work of the past. The ancient mountains crumbled and the age-old hills collapsed. His ways are eternal. I saw the tents of Cushan. You uncovered your bow. You called for many arrows. You split the earth with rivers. The mountains saw you and writhed. Sun and moon stood still in the heavens at the glint of your flying arrows. So he's speaking of the mighty things that God has done for his people, Jehovah's works of the past for his people in defending his people. Then in the last part of chapter 3, verses 16 through 19, we have the joy of salvation, the incredibleness of faith, the fact that even when things are bad, we can still rejoice in God. Listen to these words. I heard and my heart pounded, my lips quivered at the sound, my legs trembled. Yet I will wait patiently for the day of calamity. Verse 17, though the fig tree doesn't bud and there are no grapes on the vines, even though the olive crop fails and the fields produce no food, even though there are no sheep in the pen or cattle in the stalls, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will be joyful in God, my Savior. The sovereign Lord is my strength. He makes my feet like the feet of a deer. He enables me to go on the heights. What a powerful, powerful statement of faith that Habakkuk concludes with. We all need to learn the lesson of putting our burdens before God and then waiting, giving them to God and then waiting. God will answer, and we can and we should rejoice in spite of whatever circumstances, because the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of God. Habakkuk, 3 little chapters, but some powerful, powerful teaching. Let's move then to Zephaniah. Now, Zephaniah gives more of his background than the other prophets do. Zephaniah tells us that he is the great-great-grandson of King Hezekiah. Zephaniah prophesied in the days of Josiah, and he was a contemporary with Jeremiah. At the beginning of the book of Jeremiah, he tells us that he was active during the times of King Josiah. Now, Zephaniah was a prophet for Judah, meaning speaking to Judah, again, the southern kingdom, because the northern kingdom, for all intents and purposes, is gone at this time. Joel and Zephaniah are prophets of judgment against Judah. And yet, what is so special about both books is they both tell about a glorious deliverance. The structure of the book of Zephaniah, 3 chapters, like the other 2 books we've just been discussing, but the messages within them, there's not an even message for each chapter. It kind of spills from one over to the other. This first section dealing with the wrath that is coming on Judah, and that is chapter 1 and the first couple of verses of chapter 3, the wrath that's coming on Judah. The middle section is where Zephaniah speaks about the wrath that's coming on the nations that surrounded Israel. And that's from chapter 2, verse 4, and then into about the middle of chapter 3, verse 8. And then the third segment deals with going from the wrath of God to healing. And that's from verse 9 of chapter 3 through the end of chapter 3. So let's go to this first section and let's talk about the wrath that is coming on Judah. Everything in this section refers to judgment that is coming on Judah in the form of the captivity to Babylon. Why all of the wrath that is described in these verses? Be silent before the sovereign Lord, for the day of the Lord is near. The Lord has prepared a sacrifice. He has consecrated those he has invited. On the day of the Lord's sacrifice, I will punish the princes and the king's son. I will punish all who avoid stepping on the threshold. Wail, you who live in the market district. All your merchants will be wiped out. All who trade with silver will be ruined. I will search Jerusalem with lamps and punish those who are complacent. I will stretch out my hand against Judah and against all who live in Jerusalem. I will cut off from this place every remnant of Baal, the false god. The names of the pagan and idolatrous priests. There were priests that were combining worship of Jehovah with worship of this false god Baal. God says those who bow down on the roofs to worship the starry hosts, there were those who were worshiping the stars. Kind of like there are people in our day who basically worship the stars. They trust in that horoscope, that's what is going to take care of them. And brothers and sisters, it's not. We worship the maker of the stars. We don't worship the stars. And God said, here's what's happening. Those who bow down on the roofs, those who bow down and swear by the Lord, who also swear by Molech. The worship was being combined with Jehovah God and the god of Molech. God says there is going to be violence coming. Their wealth will be plundered. What else does God say? They will build houses, but they won't get to live with them in them. They will plant vineyards, but they're not going to drink the wine. It's going to be a day of clouds and blackness, a day of trumpet battle cry against the cities. It will bring distress upon their people. Their gold will not be able to save them. Their blood is going to be poured out like dust. And how about this? Their entrails like filth. Very graphic. Why? Why all of this? Well, verse 17 tells us very clearly. I will bring distress on the people, and they will walk like blind men. Here's the word, because. Because why? Because they have sinned against the Lord. Their blood will be poured out because they have sinned against the Lord. Now, this section closes with an appeal for repentance and kind of a word of encouragement to those who have kept the faith. Chapter 2, verses 2 and 3. Before the fierce anger of the Lord comes upon you, before the day of the Lord's wrath comes upon you, seek the Lord, all you humble of the land, you who do what he commands. Seek righteousness, seek humility. Perhaps you will be sheltered on the day of the Lord's anger. And let's look at the wrath on the nations that is coming. Because in the next section, the prophet turns away from Judah and Jerusalem and looks to the nations that are surrounding. First to the west. And let's take a look at our map here. And let's see if I can pop that up a little. There we go. Okay, so he's here in Jerusalem. And he is speaking from Jerusalem. He looks to the west, and this is Zephaniah. Here's Jerusalem and Judah. And he's looking first to the west, to Philistia and the Philistines. Now, you don't see that written here on the map, but Gaza, that was the capital city of the Philistines. So he looks to the west and he says, Philistines, it's coming to you too. And then he turns and he looks to the east to Ammon and Moab. Here's Ammon, here's Moab. And he says, destruction is coming to you as well. And then next, in the next verses, he looks south to Ethiopia. And the area that he is calling Ethiopia, it's not where we think of the modern country of Ethiopia, but it would be down towards this area, towards Egypt, in this area that he's talking about, to the south. And then he looks north. Where does he look north to? Assyria and Nineveh. And he says they are going to be smitten as well. And so that gives you an idea of his awareness of geography of the land, and also that God wasn't going to hold back on anyone else, and that Babylonia was going to sweep down through here, that Babylonia is going to come. They're going to take Assyria and Nineveh. They're going to sweep down. They're going to take Ammon and Moab. They're going to go to the Philistines and all the way down through here. And of course, this is exactly what happens. And then Zephaniah turns back to Jerusalem after he looks to the west and the east and the south and the north. Then he turns back to Jerusalem. It's almost as if he's saying, oh, people, now just because I've been talking about these other countries, don't forget that you are still a part of it. Because basically what Zephaniah then says to the people of Jerusalem is look, if God is going to smite these other nations, he's still going to smite you, because you have had all the privileges of being the chosen people of God. Chapter 3, verses 6 through 8. I have cut off nations, their strongholds are demolished. I have left their streets deserted with no one passing through. Their cities are destroyed. No one will be left, no one at all. I said to the city, surely you will fear me and accept correction. Then her dwelling will not be cut off, nor all my punishments come upon her. But they were still eager to act corruptly in all they did. Therefore, wait for me, declares the Lord, for the day I will stand up to testify. I have decided to assemble the nations, to gather the kingdoms, to pour out my wrath on them, all my fierce anger. The whole world will be consumed by the fire of my jealous anger. From wrath, then God moves to healing. And this is where Zephaniah is given the prophecy from God to understand that he's looking beyond the physical. He's looking beyond Judah and Jerusalem. He's not looking now in this last half of chapter 3. He's not looking now at the surrounding nations. He's looking down the road beyond to a time of healing and blessing. What he's looking to is the messianic kingdom when Jesus returns as the Messiah, and all nations are embraced, but yet the covenant people, the Hebrew people, will be the center of that kingdom. And that's what Zephaniah says in these closing verses between verse 11 and verse 20. All of the afflictions are to be over, and Israel will be made a praise among all of the people of the earth. We're struggling with that right now, aren't we? Our political forces and movers and shakers just had a vote in the Congress to say that we stand with Israel. And that needs to continue. They are the chosen people of God, and our country needs to stand with Israel through all things. They are, at this point in time, a country that is under a great deal of stress and violence from outside forces that would like to destroy Israel. There are a lot that don't see Israel as a praise among all the people of the earth. And yet we know that when Jesus returns as the Messiah and God's kingdom comes on earth, that all nations are going to praise Israel. Quiz time. So what's the main subject of the book of Nahum? Basically the same as the book of Jonah, right? The destruction of Nineveh. And I just answered our second question. What other prophet had the same subject? And of course, that's Jonah. Remember, Nahum is like a sequel to Jonah, 100 to 150 years later. What is the central truth of Habakkuk? The just shall live by faith, quoted several times in the New Testament. And when not quoted, there are other times within the New Testament that the same theme is coming out. What did Habakkuk pray for? The first thing that he prayed for when he started his prayer, that closing prayer that he has in chapter 3. What was the first thing he prayed for? Revival. Why did Zephaniah predict that the wrath was going to come on Judah? What was the reason? Why did God say he was going to bring his wrath on Jerusalem and Judah? They have sinned against the Lord. Now, what did Zephaniah see in the future for Israel? Healing and blessing. Well, I appreciate you joining us this evening. I hope you had some learning on some of our minor prophets. And when we began our study of the minor prophets, I said then, and I say it now, they're not minor because the message is any weaker or smaller. They're only called minor because there's only a few chapters in each one of them. There is powerful teaching within these. And especially in our days and times when there are just horrendous things being done and God's name is just being forgotten. God's name is being scourged, taken in vain, ignored, the teachings and the laws of God. And these prophets have a lot to say to us, and we have a lot to learn from them as well. Next week, we will be visiting the last 3 books of the Old Testament. And then following that, we will have a week of study where we will look at the time period between the Old Testament and the New Testament, because there are some very important events that happened then. There are some writings that exist from that time, and we'll examine a few of those. Again, thanks for joining. Please be in church on Sunday. If you don't have a home church and you are local to this area, you're more than welcome to join us for worship at Forest Chapel. We are just off of US Route 340, the intersection of 612 and 340, and what we call downtown Cremora, right across from Sammy's Station. Many blessings for your weekend.